Hello and welcome. When we want to know a little bit more about ourselves, we tend to look back to the people and places that made us. But what happens if we do that and find ourselves in a tangle of secrets and lies? And when we try to unravel that and discover things that shake us to the core, how does that change the way we see our parents, our life, ourselves? Meet Joe Jaquest Oteng. He's a musician, he's a professional singer, and he's here. Hi, Joe.
Hi, how you doing?
Oh, very well. Nice to see you. You grew up in Wolverhampton.
That's
you were
right.
an only child.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that childhood. So you've got a mum Sue, Dad
Yes.
Peter.
So, I grew up in Wolverhampton in the 90s. I was pretty happy doing my own thing. I was an independent kid, but I just always wanted to be exploring more of the world, basically. I think I ordered all my university prospectuses when I was about 12.
Did
I
you?
started working out where I wanted to go because I just wanted to get out. But I had a great time in Wolverhampton, but I was ready to leave when I did.
And your mum and dad lived apart, right? But they shared the parenting.
Yeah, so they lived together until I was 11, but they were never a couple. It always felt like two separate households in one house.
What did you know about your dad?
Not very much. I knew that he was from Ghana. I knew that he was one of 13 brothers and sisters, but I didn't know their names. He didn't tell me the names of his parents or what they'd been like or where they came from or where he was born. I knew a lot about his work because work was his passion. He worked for the Commission for Racial Equality. But apart from that, I didn't know much about his past.
What did you think of him as a father?
Our relationship changed over time. When I was younger, our relationship could be difficult. We weren't able to reach much common ground. But as I got older, the relationship changed, I think, because I was becoming a young man. And so there was a little bit more leeway for respect. And maybe I just wasn't as spirited, I'll say, as I was as a kid. Yeah.
You didn't talk back to him as much.
Well, I'm not saying that.
So you go off to university, you're becoming a young adult. You really engage in that passion you have for music. There's one time, though, when you go back to your dad's for Christmas, and that was quite a difficult time for you. Talk us through that.
It was. I just moved down to London and I'd been in my house in Brixton for 3 or 4 months. And I'd speak to my dad quite a lot on the phone and he seemed to be in good spirits. Everything was going well. And I went back home for Christmas and Dad used to make a big deal of Christmas. It was something that he really loved. So we would have the house that would have all the tacky decorations out the front of it, which is always embarrassing to me. But I kind of thought it was cute as well. So I went back for Christmas expecting a similar kind of situation. And I got to the house, I rang the doorbell and he knew I was coming and I didn't get an answer. So I rang again and no answer still. I'm stuck outside a house I can't get into. I can't contact my dad. My mum doesn't live in Wolverhampton anymore at this point. So I just had to wait. And an hour passed and then it was nearly 2. And eventually, as it got dark, a taxi pulled up, a black cab, and my dad was in the back of it. And I was so angry with him. So I went from the porch and I started marching over towards the taxi to have a go at him for having left his only son at the doorstep. And he opened the door, so the light came on inside the cab. And I barely recognized the man that was inside the car because he was completely emaciated. He looked very, very sick. He looked gaunt. He looked a little bit sort of confused by what was even going on. And I realised what had happened is that he'd been so ill, without explaining it to anybody, that he'd left going to get all the things he would need for Christmas until the very last minute because he didn't have the strength to do it. And I got all the shopping. We both went into the house together. And what I saw shocked me so much because the whole house was a complete bomb site. I went to the kitchen to put the shopping down and there were dirty plates stacked everywhere, rotten food. In the living room, in the living room,
Right, take your time.
Yeah. So in the living room, he would have eaten a plate of food and then put it down where he'd finished it. So there was food fused to the carpet and just mess everywhere. And it was clear that for several months, he had not been able to look after himself physically at all.
And hadn't asked for help.
And hadn't said anything. And not even that. He'd been telling me that everything was fine. But he hadn't thought through the implications of what it meant, because obviously at some point I was going to turn up and there was this house that was unlivable in. And I think it just dawned on him a little too late, and he was maybe too proud to just be honest. I realised that I couldn't handle looking after all this stuff by myself. So I called my mum and she drove down, and then we called the hospital and they came and took him in an ambulance, and he stayed in overnight. And me and my mum spent the evening, that was the 23rd of December, cleaning the house. We continued getting the house ready on the 24th, expecting him to come back for Christmas. But he never came back. He stayed in hospital until he was moved to a hospice.
Oh. When did he die?
The 8th of April, 2011. So about 4 months after he went in.
Okay. That sounds really tough.
Yeah, it was tough. It
Yeah.
was he hadn't given me the opportunity to sort of come to terms with what was going on. So I went from having, in my mind, a dad who was well and healthy and happy to one who was terminally ill with prostate cancer, is what it turned out to be.
And after his death, being the only child, I imagine quite a lot of the responsibility for just the ghastly things that you've got to do when a parent dies.
Yeah.
The sorting out the finances, the clearing the house.
Yeah.
I know your mum was around there too, but I guess a lot of that fell on you.
It basically all fell on me because... So my mum has mental health problems, and events like that can trigger her illness. And I'd just lost my dad, and I remember thinking, if I have to deal with my mom having an episode, whether that's a manic episode or becoming depressed, I'm not going to be able to cope. So I made the decision to do all the admin to take that pressure off of her. So I had to arrange the funeral, I had to get the death certificate organised, I had to clear the house and all that kind of stuff.
When clearing the house, what did you find out about your dad that you didn't know before because he hadn't told you?
Yeah, my dad was a hoarder. So his house was full of stuff. His bedroom was piled full of papers, old work reports, all kinds of stuff. And I spent a few days on the floor just going through all this stuff. Then at one point I found his passport, his Ghanaian passport, and was very confused to see that there was a date of birth that didn't relate to the date of birth that we knew him to have had. So we'd always thought that he was born on the 3rd of November, 1946. In the passport, it said he was born on the 3rd of April, 1936, which would have made him about 10 years older than we'd always thought that he was.
So you're celebrating birthdays in November when actually he'd been born in April?
Yeah, I remember celebrating his 50th birthday because it was a big birthday, but it was just a random day in his 60s at that point. So
That's so strange. Why did he do that, do you think?
Well, this was a question that I immediately had and couldn't answer, but there was so much other stuff that I had to do. I decided I just had to keep on going and sort through all the paperwork and deal with that when I dealt with all the immediately pressing issues.
Okay, so that's one to be dealt with later, is where you park that as you were going through all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And what else did you find?
After I'd found the passport, I kept on looking and I found a marriage certificate. And the name of the woman that he'd married was not my mom. It was a completely different person, a woman named Irene Faith Deborah. And they'd married in 1974 in Birmingham. And this was a woman I'd never heard of. I'd never knew that my dad was married. And yeah, I couldn't believe it.
He was married to a woman called Irene.
Yeah.
While he was with your mum.
Yes.
And while you were growing up.
Yeah.
And neither of you had ever heard of
No. And when I spoke to Mum about it, she had no idea either. The final thing that I found was a box under Dad's bed. And in the box of stuff was a bunch of photo albums and letters, and all the photos had been like carefully cut out and stuck in place. There was a lot of care and thought that had gone into it, and they were all black faces, they were all African faces. And I realised that this must be his family, a bunch of people that I thought he didn't have any ability to connect with. And yet I'm finding letters from these people from the 90s and lots of pictures, and with him in a lot of the pictures, and clearly very happy with these people. So there was this huge part of his life and a huge bunch of people that had obviously been really important to him, but he hadn't wanted to share that.
What was going through your head?
There was anger with my dad for not being truthful. There was sadness as well that he didn't feel that he could share those things with me. It was a lot to deal with, and at this point we're only 2 or 3 days after Dad had died, so I was still a bit shell-shocked anyway. So instead of confronting those issues in the moment, I focused on the practical stuff that I could do. And then I went back to London, and I didn't tell anyone that he died, so my friends knew he was sick. They asked me about how he was after he died. And I said that it was fine. I was like, it's okay. I didn't want to acknowledge my feelings, I don't think. So I just tried to ignore them and not think too much about what it meant to me, because it was easier.
Mm-hmm. Life gets busy then. Your music career takes off. You're concentrating on this for the next 10 years or so.
Yeah.
And then the pandemic hits. And with the pandemic, everything changes for everybody, really.
Yeah.
But I guess for somebody who's making their way in the music world, you can't go out and do gigs. You can't go out and sing.
Yeah.
So what happened to you? What did you do?
Yeah, I was just alone with my thoughts a lot of the time. And I was thinking, I wonder how Dad would have dealt with this lockdown. And I remembered all those unanswered questions. And I thought, well, I haven't really got anything to do. I've already watched all of Tiger King. I've watched most of Friends all over again. So I decided to start investigating my dad's life and trying to find some answers to those questions. And I did this YouTube documentary, and I wanted to have a record for myself so that I could look back on it.
Right. So let's start then with one of his friends. You met one of his very old friends,
Yeah.
Ian, who told you that he was this incredible man and said that he was really engaging and embraced his Ghanaian heritage.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been a shocker, because
It was
not the man that you knew growing up.
Not at all. It was a very different man. This young man that came to the UK from Ghana in the 60s was a man that loved his country, loved to tell people that didn't know about Ghana, about the culture, about his heritage. One of the first questions Ian asked me was, did your dad continue to wear his precious traditional Ashanti cloth robes? That was just not something that I recognised at all. And it was nice to know that it had been important to him, but it was confusing to try and figure out what had changed in his life that had stopped him from wanting to share it.
What happens next? Did you try to look for your dad's family, this huge family that was in the photo album?
Yeah.
All these people that you didn't know that are part of you?
Yeah, this was a really big part of what I wanted to discover when I started looking into Dad's life, because they're my family as well. And I realised that as I was going through it, this is not just Dad's family, this is my heritage, this is a link to a part of myself that I don't know. So I was putting a lot of time and effort into trying to track them down. There were lots of little bits of information that he'd left behind, but nothing concrete, nothing like a full name, an address and a phone number. So it would be a scrap of paper, the back of an envelope that had a return to sender address on, scribbled, that I was trying to work out. But it was really difficult because we're talking about people that were in Dad's life 50, maybe 60 years ago. So well before the internet, and I wasn't sure if they were still alive, but I just kept on digging and seeing what I could find out.
This is a full-time detective's job.
Oh, for sure. It was the thing that kept me sane throughout the pandemic.
So those little scraps of information and the scribbles on the back of an envelope, when you're going down these various alleyways, where did it lead you to?
Well, eventually it did lead me to my family. Talking about that scrap of paper, there was a name that I could just about make out on the back of that piece of paper that said J.W. Oteng, Kapong, Ghana. So I'd been holding on to that bit of information.
Because Oteng was your dad's surname.
Because Oteng was my dad's surname. And I knew from the passport, my dad's passport, that he was born in a little place called Chebi in the northern region of Ghana. So I'd been Googling the village Chebi and the name Oteng. And I found an article by a professor called Professor Alfred Oteng. So I emailed Alfred and asked him if maybe he might be related to me. And he got back to me very quickly. It turns out he wasn't related to me, but Alfred realised that he actually personally knew J.W. Oteng, who was John Oteng, who turned out to be a cousin of mine. So he was able to put me in contact with John, and John put me in contact with his brother Edward, who lives in Peckham in London. So just around the corner from where I lived in Brixton for 8 years.
Okay, so we've now got a cousin Edward.
Yeah.
You go and see Edward in Peckham.
Yes.
And what does he say?
Edward tells me about the family, and he's able to put some names to the faces of the people in this photo album. He was also able to tell me, sadly, that all of my dad's brothers and sisters had died. But he was able to tell me a lot about the people that still lived, the people that were in Ghana and around the world. And we decided to put a plan together for me to go over to Ghana to start meeting some of those people and see where my dad grew up and get a real sense of my dad's life before he came to the UK.
And that trip to Ghana, I mean, tell me about it. What was it like?
It was incredible. It was quite an experience to be in a very different environment from the one that I've grown up in. And I found out from one of my cousins that far from being one of 13 brothers and sisters, my dad was actually one of 69 brothers and sisters.
69?
Yeah. Fortunately, not all from the same woman, because that probably would have been...
Should be tired.
Should be pretty tired. Should be pretty tired, yeah. So my granddad, my dad's dad, was the chief of the village, and he had 5 wives. And between those 5 wives, he had 69 children. And my dad was the very last born.
I mean, this family's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, isn't it?
Yeah. The Christmas list is starting to get a little bit out of control.
Okay.
Yeah.
You went to your dad's birthplace. What was that like?
That was really an incredible experience. So we were picked up by 2 of my family members, both called Kwesi, and they took us in the car up to this very tiny little village, which is on the top of a mountain. And there was this single-story house. And Kwesi said to me, "That is the room that your dad was born in." So, yeah, I was kind of already floored by that. Just thinking of my dad as being in the place where my dad was born, when he seemed to have spent so much time trying to keep his past from me. And I'd found it and I'd gone back to his place of origin. It felt like a lot. And I went up the steps and I stood outside that room, just taking it in for a second. And then out of nowhere, about 50 people started coming out one after the other. First, there were about 10 women dressed in like their finest traditional clothing, all the elders of the village, these kids that were drumming, and everyone in the village had been told that I was coming, but I didn't know that. And they were there to put on a ceremony to welcome me and to have a send-off ceremony for my dad. And they took me into a courtyard. And in the middle of the courtyard, there was a picture of my dad that they'd found from when he was really young. And the women came in and danced, and all the elders went up and sat on these thrones at the top of the steps. And it was just the most amazing experience. And it was very sort of visceral. And yeah, I'd never felt anything like it. And then the chief gets up and gives a speech about my dad's life and welcomes me to the village. And there was very much this sense that they lost someone that was really important to them, because family and heritage is especially important to people in Ghana. And there was this sadness about the fact that someone that was so important had gone away and never come back and had stopped communicating and hadn't been in contact with anybody. But me turning up and me taking the time to look for them and find this tiny little remote village in the middle of nowhere, it meant a huge deal to them. And me arriving represented Dad coming home. And that's what they wanted to communicate to me.
And what did it mean to you?
It meant a lot. And I realised that it wasn't just a journey that I was doing for myself. I was representing my dad and, in a way, healing wounds that had been left when he went to the UK and then never spoke to anybody again.
But did it heal your wounds?
It did. It's been a long process of coming to terms with loss, the grief of that, the anger that went with it that's gone away over time and turned more into understanding, and then has culminated in me finding this whole new part of my identity, really understanding where my dad came from in a totally different way, and meeting these people who really treated me as though I'd always been there. I was part of the family, and it was a sense of achievement as well, because I'd been on this journey to find out more about my dad's life and to get some answers to these questions and find the family. And ultimately going to Ghana was like the final stop on the map.
And before we wrap up, tell me about Irene.
So I'd kind of given up on finding Irene. And then on my last day in Ghana, I was given a phone number from a cousin that said that they thought they knew Irene and had her number. So I called the number and this old lady answered the phone. And I was like, I know this is going to be a bit weird, but I think you might have been married to my dad. And it was Irene. And she couldn't believe that she was speaking to me because she didn't know that I existed. She asked me how Dad was because they hadn't spoken for 50 years. So she thought he was still... Yeah, I had to tell her. But because there had been such a long period where they hadn't been together, hadn't been in contact, I don't think it was as emotional connection as it could have been. So she acknowledged it as sad news, but it wasn't something that caused her a lot of pain, I don't think.
And did you meet her?
I did. I had about 90 minutes with her, and then I had to go straight back to get on my flight. She'd been introduced to Dad by a cousin, one of Dad's cousins, in the early 70s, and she was always a Ghanaian citizen, so she couldn't stay in the UK for long periods of time, but she would stay in the UK for a while Dad was studying for his masters. And he said to her, you head back to Ghana, I'll be done in a couple of months, I'll come back over to Ghana, we'll get on with our lives and just take it from there. So she went back to Ghana and waited for him, and he didn't come back. So she was calling him, he didn't answer. She was writing him letters, he didn't reply. And she literally never heard from him again for the rest of her life. And they never divorced.
Was she angry with him?
Well, I think she would have been at the time, but she's had a lot of time to sort of come to terms with it. But to think that it's your wife, someone that you've committed your life to just decide that you're not going to take things any further and not tell them what's going on or why things are over, I think is a terrible thing to do. And I was apologising to her on his behalf because I just felt that she needed to hear it from someone because she hadn't heard it from him. And that was a pattern of the time that I was in Ghana, that I felt that I was there representing him.
I'm thinking of you going around Ghana apologising to people.
Yeah, like, oh, hi, nice to meet you. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Why do you think your dad changed his age and his date of birth? What was behind that?
One thing that's been really interesting about putting out the YouTube series, Hidden Roots, was the comments that I've seen, and there is a big difference in the reaction of white British people and black African people. My white British friends are like, oh my God, I can't believe this. I can't believe that he lied and he kept so much from you and he changed his date of birth. That's so odd. But I even saw a comment today, I think, from an African woman. And she was like, yeah, people used to do that all the time. It's not that surprising. And that's the reaction I've had from a lot of my black friends who go, oh yeah, like I had an uncle that did that. He came over without paperwork, so he just made up his own date of birth because he could. So there's probably an element of just it was quite a culturally normal thing to do at that time. But then to keep that up for the rest of your life to all your nearest and dearest, I don't understand it.
How has this whole experience changed the way you view your dad and your relationship with him?
At the beginning, I thought my dad was selfish, and I was angry with him for keeping things from me, and I was angry with him for not being able to communicate, and I was disappointed that he hadn't felt that he could be close with me and share these things with me. Over time, I think I've just realised that just like everybody else, he's a flawed human being. He was doing the best he could, and things are often more complicated than you realise, and you're not always going to get the perfect answer that you're hoping for. And I've had to come to terms with the fact that maybe certain secrets went to the grave with him, and I'm not going to find the answers to those things.
Yeah.
And actually, he's not the person that I thought he was. He's not this selfish human being that didn't care about me and was trying to make my life difficult. He was trying to manage his way through his own life, and he clearly had his own issues and his own insecurities and his own trauma, and he was just doing the best he could. And now I realise that we have a lot more in common than I would have ever thought, and just by getting the chance to see where he came from, I feel a lot more connected to him.
If he was here now, what would you say to him?
I have a question for him anyway, because I would love to know why it was that he cut off all contact from his family. And that's still a mystery that I don't know the answer to. So that would be a question I would have. But in terms of what I would say to him, I guess I would just say that I forgive him, and that I hope he's proud of how far I went to connect with him.
Joe Jaquesta, thank you very much for telling us your story.
Thank you.
If you have an extraordinary story like Joe's, a discovery or a moment that's transformed you, do get in touch with us here at lifechanging@bbc.co.uk. And you can subscribe to Life Changing on BBC Sounds to hear more compelling stories from remarkable people. Until the next time, goodbye.